sake of simplicity, we'll say, is not really oriented towards helping them have a good life. The family member is instead oriented towards making them as bloody miserable as you can possibly make anyone. And what would you say? Exploiting the bond between family members in order to enable that. And then sometimes the sacrifice that's necessary is either merely distancing yourself from that person, sometimes substantively, and sometimes seriously distancing yourself from them, like we don't talk anymore, ever. And so that's pretty damn rough, and it hurts and all of that, but it's a good example of the fact that sometimes in order to extract yourself from the miserable bit of chaos that you happen to be enmeshed in, you have to let go of what you love best. If the world you are seeing is not the world you want, therefore it's time to examine your values. It's really worth thinking about, because the alternative too is to curse fate, right? Because if it isn't you, and there's nothing you can do to change, there isn't something you're doing that's wrong, then it's fate itself, it's the world itself, it's other people, let's say, because they're a huge part of the world, or it's the nature of the world itself, or it's God himself in whatever form you either believe in or don't believe in, because it's fundamentally all the same in the sort of situation that I'm describing. So, and one of the things that's really interesting, and I mentioned this before about the Israelites in the Old Testament, is that they got this right. It's really something, because what happens to the Israelites over and over in the Old Testament is that they get all puffed up about how wonderful they are, and then they make moral errors because they're arrogant, and then God comes along and just cuts them into pieces for like generation after generation, and then they wobble back to their feet, but they always maintain the same attitude, which is, we did something wrong. We did something wrong. It's like an axiom rather than observation, is that if things are not laying themselves out for us as they should be, then we cannot curse God. We have to look to ourselves. Well, and you think, well, why not curse God? Because maybe it's his fault. And that's a really good question. And one of the things that I've tried to figure out over the last 30 years is, well, why not just curse God? Because there is this arbitrary element to existence, and we are vulnerable, and there is plenty of suffering, and things are unfair. Like, there's problems, right? There's injustice and unfairness and all of these things, and endless suffering. So why not just lay it at the feet of God? And whether God exists or not, in some sense, by the way, with regards to the metaphysics of this particular discussion, is not relevant. The point remains the same either way. And the answer is, as far as I can tell, that if you refuse to take on the responsibility yourself, and you attempt to lay it at the feet of either society or being itself, then you instantly start to act in a way that makes everything much worse, not only for you, but for everyone else, and maybe even for being itself. And so, no, it's not helpful. Now, if you decide that it's you've got the problem, maybe that's not even true. Like, maybe you are someone who's being tortured by the bet between God and Satan, and like, too bad for you if that happens to be the case. But it still seems to be the appropriate thing for a human being who's standing on his or her own 2 feet in a proper manner to take the responsibility on for themselves, regardless of the counter arguments that might be made against it. That's really something. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. I also think of that, it's a Deadwood issue. One of the things you see with motifs like the phoenix. Remember when Harry Potter goes off to fight, he's like St. George, he goes off to fight the hell is that thing? The basilisk that turns you to stone when you look at it. It's a dragon for all intents and purposes. It's guarding a virgin. What's her name? It's not Virginia, it's close to that though. Ginevra, right, which is a variant of virgin and variant of Virginia. Well, when he gets bitten by the dragon and poisoned, that's the dragon of chaos, right? The thing that turns you to stone when you look at it. When he gets bitten by it, then he's going to die. And yeah, well, if you get bitten by the thing that turns you to stone when you look at it, if it bites you, man, if you're not dead, you're going to wish you are. It's one of the two. And then the phoenix flies in and cries tears into the wound, and that heals him. And the phoenix is the thing that allows the deadwood to burn off occasionally, let's say. Well, I think it's once every 100 years with a phoenix, and of course it's pretty dramatic. The whole damn bird has to go up in flames, and then there's nothing left but an egg. But there's a very serious message there too, which is that, you can compare yourself in some sense to a forest fire, to a forest, and a forest has to burn now and then for the deadwood to clear so that the forest can actually maintain its continued existence. And if you stop the forest from burning for a prolonged period of time, which happened in the United States when they were trying to manage the forest fires too tightly, then all that happens is the deadwood accumulates and accumulates and accumulates and accumulates and accumulates until the whole damn forest is deadwood, and then lightning hits it and it burns so hot that it burns the topsoil off. And then there's nothing left, nothing grows. And so that's a good moral lesson, which is don't wait too long to let the damn deadwood burn off, Maybe a little self-immolation on a daily basis might be preferable to burning yourself all the way down to the bedrock, once every 20 years or so, because maybe there won't be anything left of you when you do that. And, that happens to people all the time. I've seen that happen to people many, many times. The deadwood accumulates, the mess around them gathers, the chaos that they haven't dealt with accumulates, and then one day the spark comes and they burn so far and so fast that there's not enough left of them to recover. And then they're the people who've been eaten by the beast. They're the people who've been eaten by the dragon and now are inside its belly, another very common archetypal motif. And while maybe a hero will come along and rescue them, or maybe they'll just stay in there forever. And that's a precursor to the idea of hell. And it's not something I would recommend. So a little medicine on a regular basis is a lot better than total immolation on terms other than your own, sporadically. It's time to rid yourself of your current presuppositions. There's another thing that, see, in the Soviet Union, when Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Soviet Union and its pathologies, it sort of peaked in terms of its pathological authoritarianism when it became illegal to complain that your life wasn't going well. And you just think about how horrible that is, because lots of times your life isn't going well. I mean, and I don't mean this in some casual way. I mean, maybe you have diabetes and maybe you're going to lose your feet or something. Like, it's nothing trivial that's going on here. Something is not good. Or maybe it's economic, or maybe you're unemployed, but you see, the idea in the Soviet Union was, well, we already have all the answers. Everything's perfect already. That's what totalitarians think. Well, if everything's perfect and you're suffering, then, well, maybe there's something wrong with you. Because everything is perfect after all, and if you're suffering, then, and what are you going to come out and say? Well, I'm suffering? It's like, well, then you're evidence that things aren't perfect, right? You're like a widow or an orphan in an Old Testament story, when the kings got too high and mighty, then they wouldn't pay enough attention to the widows and the orphans, and then the prophet would come along and say, those widows and orphans, they're a lot more important than you think they are, and if you don't pay attention to them properly, then things are going to fall apart around you in a way that you just can't even imagine. And so, well, then you're sort of like your own widow and your own orphan, but you don't get to say, hey, look, things aren't perfect yet because I'm actually having still quite a rough time here. You don't get to admit to your own suffering. If you can't admit to your own suffering, then you certainly... See, the suffering, especially the additional suffering, the excess suffering, should be treated as evidence that you're not doing something quite right yet. It should be treated as evidence that you're wrong. There's something important that you're doing that's wrong. I understand how harsh that is. And I'm not saying that everyone who's suffering is suffering because they're doing something in some simple way that's wrong. I was in an elevator once in a hospital. It was a very terrifying thing. And this person got on who was just in an absolute state of shock. It was really not good. And I don't remember how this happened, but I engaged the person in conversation, and they just said that they had just been diagnosed with what looked to be terminal cancer. And what was horrifying about it was that what they were doing was going over their life in the elevator, trying to figure out what they had done in order to deserve such a fate. They'd immediately taken it on themselves as a moral failing. And that's not what I'm saying. You can't come up to someone who has cancer and say, well, if you weren't such a bloody idiot throughout your whole life, you wouldn't have cancer. And believe me, that happens a lot more than you think. And people who have diseases like that get blamed for it. That's not what I'm saying. It's not like that. It's a more generalized attitude. That is that if life isn't yet what it should be, then you have a primary responsibility to do something about it. And the place to start looking is to your own errors and to fix them. And that's a safe bet, man, because you're probably doing some things that you wouldn't have to be doing that if you fixed would make things better. So it's time to let go and to sacrifice who you are for who you could become. There's an old story about how to catch a monkey. In case any of you are interested in how to catch a monkey, now you're going to know how to do it. First, you have to take a large, narrow-necked jar, just large enough in diameter at the top for a monkey to put its hand inside. Then you have to fill it partway with rocks so it's too heavy for the monkey to carry. Then you scatter some treats near the jar to attract them, and you put some inside the narrow-necked jar. A monkey will come along, if you're lucky, and grab the, goodies, but he'll want the ones inside the jar too, so then put his hand in there and grab what's in there. And if you've set up your monkey trap properly, then he won't be able to get his hand out because he's got the goodies. Not without unclenching his hand, not without relinquishing what he already has. The monkey catcher can just walk over and just pick up the monkey, because the monkey isn't into the whole sacrifice thing, because he's just a monkey, And so you can catch him as a consequence of his own unregulated hypothalamic desires. And to be, what would you say, charitable to the monkey, if you put out candy or something like that. It's like, how often does a monkey get candy? He's probably a little more motivated than you are to not let go, but you get the point. The monkey catcher can just walk over to the jar and pick up the monkey. The animal will not sacrifice the part for the whole. That's actually a pretty good phrase, eh? It's the animal that will not sacrifice the part for the whole. Perhaps this story is apocryphal, but as an eccentric psychology professor once told me, fiction lies to you in the most truthful possible manner. Something valuable given up ensures future prosperity. Something valuable sacrificed pleases the Lord. Those are equivalent statements. One's more articulated, I would say that's the first statement, and the second one is more dramatic and more embedded in a collective religious dream, you might say. What's most valuable and best sacrificed? Well, obviously that depends on the culture and the time. What is at least emblematic of that? A choice cut of meat. Well, if you're a herdsman, for example, that's a big deal. Generally speaking, throughout human history, meat has been a very valuable commodity, as it is, by the way, among chimpanzees. Chimpanzees hunt. They like to hunt colobus monkeys. And, they'll basically start eating the damn monkey alive. They weigh about 40 pounds, despite the fact that the thing is screaming away. And that's pretty interesting, because one of the things it indicates is that male monkeys, male chimps, they're the ones that do the hunting, aren't really inhibited that much when they're in hunter mode by what you might describe as empathy. And there's certain elements of human behavior that are reminiscent of that. You see that sort of thing emerge now and then in human battlefields when groups of men seem to abandon all internal regulation whatsoever to a degree that makes you wonder if internal regulation even exists. Choice cut of meat. Well, meat's valuable, and there's a good document by Richard Wrangham, I think, a while back, a book about the human invention of fire, and I think I told you a little bit about this. Wrangham claimed that we invented fire, discovered fire, mastered it, maybe 2 or 3 million years ago. That's a long time, longer than people had thought, and that's what actually transformed us physiologically from our chimp-like ancestors into the sort of svelte creatures we are now, because it's a lot easier to digest cooked meat, and meat is a tremendous source of nutrition, energy, raw materials, all of that, especially if it's cooked. So meat's a big deal. Cooked meat is a big deal. And maybe it's a choice cut of meat. kind you might offer to a guest if you're not I always say this wrong. Is it vegan? Vegan, or vegan. I always think vegan, but that's wrong. That's a star. Vega's a star, right? They're not like star creatures. They're, yeah. Anyway, so, you might offer that, especially if a guest came to your abode and you were a herdsman. You might sacrifice a high-end animal and offer your guest a nice choice cut of meat, and that would actually matter. It would mean something. From the best animal in a flock. What's above even that? Well, in terms of the thing you could sacrifice, well, your best animal, that's good. Well, how about you? How about your child? How about you? Well, that would be next on the hierarchy. It's kind of hard to get past that, right? And I think it's a toss-up whether the sacrifice is greater if it's you or if it's your child. I would say, being a parent, that it's greater if it's your child. Because I think most people who have established I hesitate to say proper, but I'm going to anyway, it's a proper relationship with their children. If push came to shove, they'd take the bullet and let their kid go, live. The sacrifice of the mother is exemplified profoundly by Michelangelo's great sculpture, the Pieta. Mary is contemplating her son crucified and ruined, so that's his body after he's been crucified. It's her fault. It was through her he entered the great drama of being. So what's the meaning of this sculpture? It's a great sculpture. It's just an absolutely unbelievable sculpture. You just can't believe that someone could exist who could make something like, and of course it wasn't the only thing Michelangelo made, right? It wasn't like, that's it. It was something he just tossed off in a couple of months while he was doing other unbelievable things. But, it's an object of contemplation, which is why it's in a great cathedral in a great city. It's an object of contemplation, and the idea is something like, well, what's the role of a mother if she's awake? I had a client come see me a while back, not very long ago. Woman who's about 30 and trying to make decisions about her life. And she was pretty career-oriented, and so I asked her about, although maybe having a bit of trouble with her career. I've seen this many, many times. So this is an amalgam. This is a story that's an amalgam. And I talked to her about the other elements of her life. It's like, well, there's only 5 things you do in life. So you've got your career down. What do you do outside of your career that's meaningful and engaging? How are things going with your family? It could be your family of origin, your siblings, whatever. Do you have an intimate relationship? And what's your plan for your own family? And apart from those 5 things, there's sort of something like get some exercise now and then, don't eat too badly, and try to stay away from the drugs, That kind of, and the crime, that kind of lays out life. And if you miss any of those 5 things, or if you do any of those other things wrong, then you're in trouble. And you can get away with missing a couple of them, but not all of them. And she said something along the lines of, well, I'm not sure I should bring a child into this world. And I thought, oh, God, Christ, you got to come up with something better than that. It's such a bloody cliche, which is what I told her. I said, you must have thought that up when you were 16. It's like, really? You can't do any better? This was a very, very smart woman. It's like, really, you can't do any better than that? It's like, yes, obviously, this is a vale of tears and, a well of suffering and all of that. If you ask 30 people who are wondering about having children, why they're wondering, 20 of them will say that. And so that tells you how original it is. It's not original at all. It's not a thought. It's like this little, it's a meme. It's something that lives in your mind. It's not a thought. And it's certainly not something that you should just take at face value and then say, oh, well, I'm not having a family then. It's like, no. You kind of look at that and you criticize it a little bit. It's like, well, it's the other one. That's the other one that's very common. There's too many people on the planet already. It's like, I really don't like that statement. It's like, just who are you going to ask to leave? Just how are you going to get them to leave? It's a serious question. And who says there's too many people? What the hell's wrong with people anyways? Or running around ruining the planet. Yeah. It's like, I think it was the Club of Rome who who prophesied, by the way, that there would be so many people on the planet by the year 2000 that there would be widespread starvation. And they were completely and utterly wrong about that. And I think it was the Club of Rome who either compared us to a virus or a